Hey everybody, it's me, Stuart. Today we're going to read a story called Black Beauty. It's a story about horses. Horses are my best friends. Let's see what happens. Here we go. The first home I can ever remember was a lovely lush green meadow owned by Farmer Gray. I lived there with my mother, Duchess, who was the master's favorite. I spent my younger days frolicking in the fields, splashing in the pond, and playing with the other colts. It was a wonderful life. One day, as we were playing a rough game that involved a lot of kicking and biting, my mother called me to her. She told me, "The other colts that live here are not bad creatures, but they have never learned manners. To grow into a proud and respectable stallion, you must do your work without complaining, lift your feet high when you trot, and never ever kick or bite." My mother was wise, so I took her advice to heart. It's not good to kick or bite. Soon after, Farmer Gray decided that I was old enough to learn to be a working horse. I needed to learn how to pull a cart or a carriage and to have people ride on my back. This training was called my breaking in, and it wasn't fun at all. I had to wear a bridle, which was made of straps that went around my head and under my nose and chin. I didn't like that very much, and I had to wear a bit, which was a metal rod that was placed in my mouth and attached to the bridle and reins. That was the worst. If I didn't turn my head the right way when my master pulled on the reins, the bit would hurt my mouth. But my master was kind and gentle, and soon I learned what he needed me to do. I actually felt quite proud carrying him around on my back. What a grown-up horse I had become. When I was 4 years old, which meant I was fully grown, it was time for Farmer Gray to sell me. One day, a man named Squire Gordon came to the farm. He picked up my feet and checked my hoofs, and he opened my mouth and looked at my teeth. It was very tempting to give the cheeky chap a quick nip, but I remember what my mother had taught me, and he decided he liked what he saw. I was excited to see what my new life would bring, but I was very sad to say goodbye to my mother and Farmer Gray. I nuzzled them both and whinnied a soft farewell as I was led away. Squire Gordon lived on a big fancy farm with a pretty white horse and wonderfully spacious, bright, tidy stables. That was where I met John, the groom, and Joe, the stable boy. They both looked me over and agreed I was as fine a horse as ever they saw. I liked them both immediately, though I could tell Joe was young and didn't know a lot about horses. They brushed me and fed me a bucket of oats and led me into a comfortable stall spread with fresh straw. "The squire says you're to be called Black Beauty," Joe said as he patted me gently on the nose. I felt very proud to have such a grand name. Once they left, I looked around and realized I was not alone. In the stall beside me was a stout little gray pony, who introduced himself as Merrylegs. "I'm very important around here," he told me proudly. "I am responsible for teaching the squire's 2 little daughters." "Teaching them what?" I asked, puzzled. "To ride horses, of course," he answered. Well, I had heard of people training horses, but never of horses training people. What a funny place this was. I let them ride on my back, but if they are silly or misbehave, then I give a little buck and they fall right off into the mud, and that teaches them, he explained. That was when I heard a snort from another stall at the back of the stable, and I looked around to see a chestnut mare in the far corner. She was eyeing me angrily. "Oh, don't worry about Ginger," Merrylegs told me. "She likes to tease me because she secretly fancies me. I am quite irresistible, you see." I wasn't sure I believed him, but I liked Merrylegs immediately. Ginger rolled her large eyes at us and turned away. I found out later that Ginger was very grumpy because I had been given her stall. She had bitten one of the master's grandchildren, and they had become frightened of her. Over the following weeks, I went through my training. Ginger ignored me as much as she could until one day we were putting the harness together to pull the master's carriage. We worked well together and began to talk to one another while we worked. I learned that Ginger hadn't always had a nice home like the one we share now, and that she had been mistreated by her former owners. This had made her nervous of people, but she was learning to be more trusting as she spent more time with kind and gentle folks like John, Joe, and Squire Gordon. Over time, we became good friends. One day, as Ginger and I were bringing John home from town, I saw my first example of a horse being treated badly. Bill Bushby, a man who worked for the neighbor, was trying to force his pony to jump a gate that was clearly too high for him. The pony refused to jump, so Bill climbed from the saddle and began to whip him, and when the pony still refused to jump, Bill began to kick him. This made John furious. He leaped out of the carriage to put a stop to Bill's terrible treatment of the pony when, all of a sudden, the pony put his head down and threw up his heels, kicking bratty Bill up into the air. He went up and up, then seemed to freeze in midair before he came tumbling back down like a sack of potatoes, landing right in a thorny blackberry bush. Bill scrambled around, untangling himself from the bush as the pony took off toward home at a gallop. Billy followed behind, yelling, "Ouch, ouch, ouch," and pulling thorns out of his backside as he ran. "Well, that fixes that," chuckled John, and climbed back into the carriage. He even made sure to tell the neighbor what had happened so the poor pony wouldn't be in trouble, and I liked John even more after that. It's not nice to beat horses. What are we doing? One day during winter, John harnessed me to a small cart. I was to take him and Squire Gordon into town on some urgent business. It had been raining for many days, and when we reached the wooden bridge that crossed the river, the water was rising fast. "We'll have to return as quickly as we can before this bridge is flooded," warned John, and Squire Gordon nodded his agreement. But because the country roads were slick with mud, the wind was howling, and the rain was pouring, it took a long time to reach the town. By the time Squire Gordon had completed his business, and we had made it back to the bridge, the water was even higher, with a few inches of water covering the center of the bridge. "Drive on," said Squire Gordon. "We'll make it across if we hurry." John gave me a light touch with his whip and urged me on. But the moment I took my first step onto the bridge, I came to a dead stop. I knew something was wrong. "Crack the whip, John," said Squire Gordon. "We need to get across fast." John urged me on again, but still I wouldn't budge. I could tell the squire was becoming cross with me. "There's something wrong, sir," John said. Of course, I couldn't tell him, but I knew the bridge wasn't safe. At that very moment, there came a terrible crack like the sound of thunder, and the whole center section of the bridge tore away and was washed downstream. John and the squire were shocked. "You clever horse, Beauty," said Squire Gordon. "If you had taken us over that bridge, we all would have been washed into the river and drowned." Both John and Squire were very pleased with me. And when we finally reached home, I was given a huge supper of bran, crushed beans, and oats. John even had Joe make an extra thick bed of straw for me, for which I was very grateful, as I'd never been so tired in my life. Good job, Black Beauty. You saved them. Those days at Squire Gordon's farm were very happy ones. Ginger, Merrylegs, and I worked hard, but we were treated well and often had time to play in the meadow. We would chase each other across the field, roll around in the long grass, and even wade into the pond on hot days. Merrylegs would even have Ginger in stitches as he pranced around the field, showing us how fine a stallion he would make for a lord or lady. Merrylegs was only half our size, and so would never be able to carry anyone larger than a small child. He would trot around on his short, stumpy legs, then stop to pose with one hoof in the air. Late one afternoon, while we were frolicking in the field, John came running to the fence and called to me urgently. I galloped to the gate and he led me to the stable. "It's the mistress," he said as he placed the saddle on my back, and I wonder why he always spoke to me even though he didn't know that I could understand him. "She's very ill and we must fetch the doctor. We must ride faster than we've ever ridden before." Once I was ready to go, he leaped up onto my back and I galloped out of the stable and towards the doctor's house. That day I ran like the wind. John didn't need to use the whip because he knew I was running as fast as my legs could carry me. We traveled for miles, passed over a hill, went through a village, clattered over a rickety bridge, and passed another village before we finally reached the doctor's house. It was late and the air was cool when we arrived. John banged on the door and the doctor answered. When John told him of the emergency, the doctor was quite troubled. "My horse is lame and I can't take him out," he explained. "I have no way of getting to Miss Gordon." "Take Black Beauty," said John. "He's tired, but I'm sure he's got the heart to get you there in quick time." The doctor quickly fetched his bag and John handed over the reins. I raced back home as fast as I could. My heart was pounding, my breathing was short, and my legs were tired, but I wouldn't let my master down. When we finally reached home, the doctor raced inside and Joe, who had been pulled from his bed, led me back to the stables and into my stall. I was shaking and panting and had sweat running down my sides. Joe, who was still learning how to care for horses, didn't know what to do. I needed a blanket to keep me warm so that I could cool down slowly, but Joe gave me a bucket of icy water and some hay, then went back to bed. The next morning when John arrived home and came to check on me, I was very ill. My shaking had grown worse, and I was icy cold. I had developed a fever. John was very angry with Joe. He told Joe that I might die, and Joe began to sob. Joe was very sorry and promised he would do everything he could to nurse me back to health. Joe lived up to his promise. He fed me and brushed me and talked to me every day, and we became the best of friends. Soon I was well enough to go back into the meadow, but it was many months before I was well enough to work again. Miss Gordon had shaken off her illness, but she was very frail, and the doctor advised that the family move to a warmer climate so her health could improve. So, the family packed up the house and got ready to leave. Sadly, we horses were not to go with them. John organized a new home for Ginger and me with the grand lord and lady who lived in a big manor house close by. Merrylegs was sold to a local minister who had 2 young boys. He said he was very jealous of Ginger and I and could not understand why he wasn't chosen to pull a fancy lord's carriage. We all said a very goodbye to the squire and his family, and especially to John and Joe, and Ginger and I left to begin a new life. Unfortunately for us, it wasn't the kind of life we had been hoping for. Oh no. Soon after arriving at our new house, a grand estate owned by Lord and Lady White, I was introduced to a cruel contraption called a bearing rein. The bearing rein was attached to the top of my bridle and then pulled tight so that my head was yanked up and back into quite an uncomfortable position. Ginger was very upset when our new groom, York, tried to place it on her, as she had endured the bearing rein before. York, who was a kind man, calmed Ginger and told her that he would not pull the rein too tight. Once we were harnessed, York pulled the carriage around to the front of the house, where the sour-faced Lady White waited to climb aboard. She was angry when she saw us. "Pull those reins tighter," she snapped at York. "You can't expect me to be seen in town with my horses' heads practically scraping the ground. How vulgar. What would people think?" York gently tightened the bearing rein, pulling our heads up even higher. It was becoming quite painful. "Tighter, tighter, tighter," shrilled Lady White. York tried to argue, but the lady wouldn't hear of it, so he tightened the rein until my neck hurt terribly, and I found it very difficult to breathe. "Much better," said Lady White, and climbed into the carriage. That trip into town was awful. Ginger and I were in pain. We couldn't breathe properly, and our legs felt weak, but still Lady White instructed York to whip us to make us go faster. Oh no, that's not good. When we arrived home and finally had our harnesses removed, York brushed us down, gave us food and water, and patted our noses. We knew he felt terrible about the way he'd had to treat us. "I'd like to put a brace around her neck and give her a sound whipping," he said as he worked. "I can't believe someone would so mistreat a horse for the sake of fashion." I couldn't believe it either. We worked wearing the bearing rein for a long time, and when we weren't working, we were stuck in our stalls. There was no frolicking in the field anymore. Finally, Ginger couldn't take it anymore. One day, when a stable boy tried to put the bearing rein on her, she reared, kicked, and lunged to him. She was no longer allowed to pull a carriage afterwards, and instead, she was given to Lord White's son to ride. One day, a groom and I went into the village on an errand, and we didn't leave again until well after dark. The groom didn't notice my shoe was loose, and as we rode, it came off. He whipped me to go faster, and I tried, but my foot was very sore. At last, I stumbled and fell, hurting my knees terribly. York did his best to help me recover, but I was no longer fit to pull a fancy carriage, so I was sent to the horse market. I was only able to whinny a quick farewell to Ginger, who was very poorly. She had been ridden too hard, which had damaged her lungs and back. Oh no. At the horse market, I was placed in a pen with many other horses, and buyers came to inspect us. They checked our eyes and teeth and legs, and soon the auction started, and we were sold one by one. When it was my turn, several people bid, and I was glad that it was a friendly-looking fellow who finally bought me. I soon found out that my new job was to pull a cab in London. I had lived my whole life in the countryside with sweet grass in the meadows and the smell of jasmine in the air. When I reached London, I couldn't believe my nostrils. It was like rotten eggs, dead fish, and stinky socks all rolled into one putrid smell. It made my eyes water, but my new master, Jerry, didn't even seem to notice the stink. Jerry lived on a quiet lane with a small but cozy stable at the back of his cottage. Jerry was a kind master who looked after me very well, and his wife Polly and their children would often bring me little treats. I felt like part of their family. Pulling a cab was hard work, but I always did my best for Jerry, just like my mother taught me. We came to know each other very well, and with a few words or a gentle pull on the rein, I could tell what he wanted me to do, so he never, ever had to use his whip. Not all cab horses were as lucky as I was, and I found this out one wintry day when we pulled up beside another cab. The first thing I noticed was that the cab was driven by a squinty-eyed cabbie who looked decidedly cruel. I looked to the front of the cab and saw an old, scrawny, exhausted chestnut mare who looked like she was about to collapse. I felt very sorry for the poor creature, and I neighed hello. She turned her head, looked at me with side eyes, and said, "Hello, beauty." At first, I was puzzled that she knew my name, and then, with a shock, I realized it was Ginger. Poor Ginger. I put my head against hers, and we stayed like that until Jerry called out for me to start moving. I didn't want to leave Ginger, but I had to obey my master, so we pulled away. After that, I often thought sadly of Ginger and hoped that she had moved on to better pastures. I also thought about happy little Merrylegs, who had always made me laugh, and wondered what had become of him. I stayed with Jerry for many years and lived a happy life, but Jerry was getting old, and finally it was time for him to retire. The family was very sad to say goodbye, but they couldn't afford to keep me, so back to the horse market I went. I was no longer as young and strong and fit as I used to be, so when I arrived to the market, I was placed in a pen at the back with other horses who were old or sick or frail. I worried about what kind of owner would buy me next. When the auction started and it was my turn to be sold, I was horrified to see Ginger's owner, the squinty-eyed cabbie, place a bid on me. Nobody else seemed interested in buying me, and I was sure I was facing a life as dreadful as Ginger's. The man climbed onto the fence and grinned at me, and, for the first time in my life, I was tempted to bite and kick and run away. But then someone called through the crowd, and it was the greatest sound I had ever heard in my life. I recognized that voice. "I'll pay double," it said, and I looked around to see my old friend Joe at the fence. He was a grown man now, but I would have known him anywhere. I ran to the fence and nuzzled his face while he patted my head and told me how much he missed me. The cruel cabbie threw his hat on the ground and stomped up and down, then picked it up and stormed off, muttering under his breath, which made Joe laugh. A few hours later, we were trotting down the road and I began to recognize the countryside. We were heading back toward Squire Gordon's old farm, and I was overjoyed. Joe could sense my excitement as we entered through the gate, and he leaned over and whispered in my ear, "Welcome home, beauty." I love my life on the farm with Joe. I work when he needs me to, but otherwise I spend my days grazing in the meadow. I'm too old for frolicking now and wading in the pond. And best of all, Joe has promised I will have a home here with him forever. Yeah. The end. Wow. That was a fun story about Black Beauty. I'm glad I finally found where Black Beauty belonged, at the farm with Joe. Yeah. Happy ending. Alright, well thanks for watching. Be sure to check out my other videos. See ya!